The rediscovery of the world's largest bee, the resurrection of the direwolf, iguanas, bats, marsupials, and more. These are 10 extinct species that turned out not to be so extinct after all. This one's fresh, it just happened a few months ago. For years, scientists were sure that two strange little marsupials had been extinct for a long time. All anyone had were fossils and old bones, so the assumption was they died out over 6,000 years ago. But it turns out that was wrong. Researchers found proof that both animals were still alive and well, hiding out in the remote forests of New Guinea. The two species are the pygmy long-fingered possum and the ring-tailed glider. Scientists call this kind of comeback a Lazarus species. Researchers pieced together from an old museum specimen that had been misidentified for decades. They also found rare photos, fossil records, and reports passed down from local communities who had known about these animals this entire time. Professor Tim Flannery, one of the scientists behind the find, called it remarkable, saying finding even one species thought to be recently extinct is a big deal, but finding two that were presumed gone for thousands of years, that's something else entirely. Look at the size of that thing. Wallace's giant bee, it's the biggest bee on the planet. But for a long time, people weren't even sure it was still around. British naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace first discovered it back in 1858 on the Indonesian island of Bacan, describing it as a big black wasp-looking insect with jaws like a stag beetle. After that, it basically vanished. It took more than 100 years before an American entomologist named Adam Messer found it again in 1981 on a few Indonesian islands. He was the first person to actually watch how these bees live, seeing females scrape up tree resin with their huge jaws to build nests inside termite mounds. But then it disappeared again, this time for 38 years, and a lot of people assumed that it was finally gone for good. But in 2019, a team went searching through remote Indonesian islands, checking termite nest after termite nest, until they finally spotted one female bee inside a tree. That was the first time anyone had ever photographed the species alive in the wild. Confirmed the bee was still hanging on, but just barely. It's still classified as vulnerable, and deforestation keeps shrinking its habitat. And this is another recent one. For years, scientists worried this bizarre ocean creature was on its way out. The sunflower sea star can grow over 3 feet across, but it got hit hard by one of the worst marine die-offs on record. Between 2013 and 2017, a disease called sea star wasting syndrome wiped out billions of sea stars along the Pacific coast. Then the species took some of the worst losses, disappearing completely in a lot of areas. That created a domino effect. Sunflower sea stars are one of the main predators keeping purple sea urchins in check, and urchins eat kelp. Once the sea stars were gone, urchin numbers exploded and just tore through entire kelp forests. Around the Farallon Islands, roughly 90% of the kelp habitat was lost. But then in 2025, during a dive off Northern California, researchers found 18 living sunflower sea stars in the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. NOAA diver Tyler Mears said it was surreal, that for anyone who'd seen these animals before the disease hit, it felt almost like running into an old friend. For decades, people figured the coastal marten had vanished from California completely. It was hunted heavily for its fur, and by the 1900s, scientists assumed that it was extinct. But in 1996, a Forest Service biologist found a small surviving population up in Northern California. They'd hung on after all. Even after that, though, they were tough to study. These animals are shy, they spend most of their time buried in thick forests, so nobody really knew how many were left or exactly where they lived. That started to change in 2022 when Oregon State University researchers set up hidden cameras and hair traps across a wide stretch near Klamath, California. After running DNA on the samples they collected, they identified 46 individual martens, 28 males and 18 females. So they weren't just barely clinging on to one spot, they were spread across several parts of the region. Their future is still iffy though. Coastal martens need older, established forest, and that kind of habitat keeps getting hit by wildfires, climate change, and logging. For close to 50 years, everyone assumed the Jamaican iguana was extinct. It was officially declared gone in 1948 after habitat loss and animals like mongooses, feral cats, and dogs wiped out most of the population. Then in 1990, a pig hunter named Edwin Duffus was out in Jamaica's Hellshire Hills when his dog came back dragging a big injured lizard. He took it to the zoo, and that's when things got interesting. It wasn't just any lizard, it was a Jamaican iguana, a species nobody'd seen in decades. So researchers flocked to the area, and they eventually found a small group of them in the forest. They were still in rough shape, so conservationists set up a breeding and release program, raising young iguanas in safety until they were big enough to have a real chance out in the wild. And since then, hundreds have been released. Not only is it great to see an animal species not die out, they're also important for their ecosystem. They spread seeds that help keep Jamaica's forests healthy. For years, everyone assumed the greater Bermuda snail was gone. The tiny snail, about the size of a button, disappeared from the wild after dealing with habitat loss, climate change, predators that have been introduced to the island. About 10 years ago, researchers found a small surviving group in an alleyway in Hamilton, Bermuda's capital city. There were fewer than 200 left, so conservationists stepped in with the goal of bringing the entire species back from the brink. They teamed up with Chester Zoo in England, where the snails were carefully bred before being shipped back to Bermuda. What started as a tiny handful has now grown into over 100,000 greater Bermuda snails. Researchers confirmed 6 separate colonies are living out in the wild, and some are even expanding into new territory. Thomas Popp from Chester Zoo called it every conservationist's dream, saving an entire species from disappearing. What makes it even more remarkable is how close the species came to vanishing without anyone noticing. These snails matter to their ecosystems as well, helping recycle nutrients by feeding on plants. For thousands of years, the direwolf only existed in fossils and old stories. This huge wolf disappeared around the end of the Ice Age, leaving behind bones and a reputation as one of the coolest extinct animals ever. Recently, a biotech company called Colossal Biosciences claimed to have created 3 direwolf-like pups through genetic engineering. They used DNA pulled from ancient remains, including a tooth that's 13,000 years old and a skull dating back 72,000 years, to figure out what set direwolves apart from modern wolves genetically. And they used those differences to modify gray wolf cells. The result was 3 pups: Romulus and Remus, born October 1st, 2024, and Khaleesi, born January 30th, 2025, named after the direwolves from Game of Thrones. Now, to be clear, these aren't actual cloned direwolves. Scientists didn't bring back the exact original species. What they created are genetically modified wolves designed to carry traits that are similar to the extinct animal. The pups were born through surrogate dogs and are being raised under close watch on a huge, heavily monitored preserve with cameras, drones, and security, so researchers can track how their behavior develops over time. For more than 100 years, scientists thought the Fernandina giant tortoise was extinct. It was last confirmed back in 1906 on Fernandina Island in the Galapagos. And after decades with no sightings, everyone assumed that it was gone. But then in 2019, researchers exploring the island came across an adult female tortoise that looked an awful like the extinct species. At first, they couldn't be totally sure. Fernandina giant tortoises were only known from a handful of old specimens, so more proof was needed. But thanks to DNA testing, they confirmed it. She was the real deal. She was nicknamed Fernanda and became the first confirmed living member of her species since 1906. Another interesting aspect here, though, Fernandina Island is an active volcano with brutal conditions, exactly the kind of place scientists figured, well, then nothing could have survived for that long, but somehow at least one tortoise did. Researchers are still studying Fernanda now, hoping to learn more about the species and figure out if others might be still out there on that island. For more than 120 years, scientists believed the New Guinea Big-eared Bat had disappeared for good. The only known specimens were collected way back in 1890, and after that, nobody could track down another one. Over time, researchers assumed, well, it had gone extinct. But in 2012, 2 researchers working in Papua New Guinea set a bat trap and caught a small bat with unusually large ears. At first, they had no idea what they were looking at. Was it some entirely new species? The mystery got solved when they compared it against old museum specimens and confirmed it was actually the New Guinea Big-eared Bat, alive and well after more than a century without a single confirmed sighting. What makes this one especially interesting is how little was actually known about the species to begin with. Even basic details like where it lived or how many there were was a complete mystery even after it was rediscovered. For decades, scientists were convinced the Lord Howe Island stick insect was extinct. This giant insect used to be common on Australia's Lord Howe Island until invasive rats showed up in 1918 and started hunting them down. Their numbers took a nosedive, and after years without a confirmed sighting, the species was officially declared extinct by the 60s. But then in 2001, researchers made an incredible find on Ball's Pyramid, a steep, jagged volcanic rock sitting about 20 kilometers from the island. Living on that isolated rock was a small population of large stick insects that looked almost exactly like the extinct species. Almost. It looked slightly different from the old museum specimens, so scientists couldn't immediately confirm it was the same animal, but genetic testing settled it. These were in fact Lord Howe Island stick insects. Somehow this small group had survived for decades in one of the most unlikely places, a bare rock in the middle of the ocean. Since then, conservationists have bred the insects in captivity and started reintroducing them back in the wild after finally clearing out all those rats. That has been the video, and I will catch you, yes you specifically, in the next one.